What's up, English 9? This is Mr. Lutwin coming to you from the sunny shores of ITC. And today I'm going to be talking a little bit with you about characterization in chapter 1 from Of Mice and Men. Hopefully you have started the book and hopefully you are loving the book. I always like to start out with a nice round of applause for the author, John Steinbeck. Thank you for creating something that's 80 some odd years later, people are still enjoying and reading and talking about. So today we're going to focus on characterization. Okay, so as you know, characterization is the creation or construction of a fictional character. Now, George and Lenny are not real, but here we are talking about them. Okay, we're discussing them as if they were real, as if we knew them. That, my friends, is characterization. So how do we know how someone is characterized in a book or a story or a play? Listed here are a couple different examples of characterization, and I'm sure that we could apply some of these terms to George and or Lenny in chapter 1 of Mice and Men. There's a couple of different ways we're able to see how a person is characterized in a fictional work. And today I'm going to be using this STEAL acronym. And what's great about this is it really does break it down as to the different ways we see how a character is created. Now, a lot of these are going to overlap as we're looking at the chapter. Okay, so for example, there's a whole bunch of speech, the S, there's a whole bunch of speech in chapter 1. There's a lot of dialogue, okay? And sometimes that dialogue reveals emotions. Sometimes it informs actions. Sometimes it helps us understand a character's thoughts. So we're going to be looking at this in sections, but I want you to remember that characterization really is about the way you feel about the individual, okay? Always trust your gut when it comes to a person. Some of you may look at George in chapter 1 and think, man, he is so mean. Others may look at George and say, well, I understand why he is so frustrated. So you're free to have these debates. There's no one way to look at a character, okay? And additionally, as we're talking about this stuff, I may not have included the things that you thought were important to building George's character because I can't really include everything. So I've got a couple of different examples to show you here about the way George is characterized in chapter 1. So the first step that we're going to take in the STEAL process is looks, because this is really the first thing that Steinbeck gives us. And he says, the first man was small and quick, dark of face, with restless eyes and sharp, strong features. Every part of him was defined, small, strong hands, slender arms, a thin and bony nose. Now, you might think that the physical description is not as important as the other elements of characterization, and you're probably right. His physical description is important because it's the exact opposite of Lenny's. It's almost like George's smallness accentuates Lenny's largeness. They're opposites in so many ways, yet here they are traveling and looking out for each other, etc. So right now we're going to take a look at one of the first things that George says in chapter 1, and it definitely reveals some of his emotions. So the author says, George stared morosely at the water. The rims of his eyes were red with sun glare. He said angrily, we could just as well have rode clear to the ranch if that bastard bus driver knew what he was talking about. Just a little stretch down the highway, he says. Just a little stretch. Goddamn near 4 miles, that's what it was. Didn't want to stop at the ranch gate, that's what. Too goddamn lazy to pull up. Wonder he isn't too damn good to stop in Soledad at all. Kicks us out and says, just a little stretch down the road. I bet it was more than 4 miles. Damn hot day. So now we're looking at two things here, okay? We're looking at what George is saying and how he says it, okay? His language helps us understand that he is very upset with this bus driver. He's upset at the situation. We don't know yet what's happened in George's recent past, the other reasons why he's upset, but we can definitely tell through his swearing and through the way the author gives us these, adverbs here, the way he says something, the way he stares, that George is in a pretty nasty mood. He is upset with something. Let's continue and look at George's characterization. Now, this might look a little jumbled and crazy, but what I'm trying to show you is how speech, emotions, and actions all sort of run together to help us understand who George is, okay? Now, if you notice in chapter 1, George has a lot of ups and a lot of downs. There's a lot of moments where George is really angry, really aggravated, and other times where he's very compassionate, very understanding. And his speech, the way he says these things, follows that pattern. So in this passage from chapter 1, it says, George stood up and threw the mouse as far as he could into the darkening brush, and then he stepped to the pool and washed his hands. So these are his actions. This is what he does. Here is his speech. You crazy fool. Don't you think I could see your feet was wet where you went across the river to get it? He heard Lenny's whimpering cry and wheeled about. Blubbering like a baby. Jesus Christ, a big guy like you? Lenny's lip quivered and tears started in his eyes. Aw, Lenny, George put his hand on Lenny's shoulder. I ain't taking it away just for meanness. That mouse ain't fresh, Lenny. And besides, you've broke it petting it. You get another mouse that's fresh, and I'll let you keep it a little while. So this is a perfect example of where you see George, his actions reflect his feelings. He takes this mouse and he throws it as far as he can. But then he realizes the effect that he's having on Lenny. He sees Lenny crying and he feels terrible. And George puts his hand on his shoulder and tries to explain the situation to him the best he can. So George definitely has the capacity to be sympathetic. He understands that the things he does upset Lenny. And, this is a good small example of the up and the down of George's character. Okay, now this is a big one. This is a big paragraph, okay? This is going to include speech, emotions, actions, and thoughts, but his thoughts are revealed through his speech, okay? So this is when George and Lenny are sitting down for a nice bean supper, and the revelation from Lenny that he wished, he had some ketchup with his beans just pushes George over the edge. And so the lines go, there's enough beans for 4 men, George said. Lenny watched him from over the fire. He said patiently, I like 'em with ketchup. Well, we ain't got any, George exploded. Whatever we ain't got, that's what you want. God almighty, if I was alone, I could live so easy. I could go get a job and work and no trouble, no mess at all. And when the end of the month come, I could take my $50 and go into town and get whatever I want. Why, I could stay in a cat house all night. I could eat any place I want, hotel or any place, and order any damn thing I could think of. And I could do all that every damn month. Get a gallon of whiskey or sit in a pool room and play cards or shoot pool. Lenny knelt and looked over the fire at the angry George, and Lenny's face was drawn with terror. And what I got? George went on furiously. I got you. You can't keep a job and you lose me every job I get. Just keep me shoving all over the country all the time. And that ain't the worst. You get in trouble. You do bad things and I got to get you out. His voice rose nearly to a shout. You crazy son of a bitch. You keep me in hot water all the time. He took on the elaborate manner of little girls when they are mimicking one another. Just wanted to feel that girl's dress. Just wanted to pet it like it was a mouse. Well, how the hell did she know you just wanted to feel her dress? She jerks back and you hold on like it was a mouse. She yells and we got to hide in the irrigation ditch all day with guys looking for us. And we got to sneak out in the dark and get out of the country. All the time, something like that. All the time. I wish I could put you in a cage with about 1,000,000 mice and let you have fun. His anger left him suddenly. He looked across the fire at Lenny's anguished face, and then he looked ashamedly at the flames. I mean, this is just brilliant, folks. What a moment here, okay? George gets sent over the edge because Lenny is asking for ketchup, and George is basically telling him, listen, man, what else can I do for you? I've provided everything. We had to run from our last job because of the trouble that you got into. I got us new jobs. I'm feeding you. I'm taking care of you. And without this moment, we wouldn't get all of this characterization of George. We wouldn't see how pent up and frustrated he is with his situation. But in the end, he loves Lenny. He is willing to sacrifice these things for Lenny because he does it. And we do get this, this pressure valve just exploding, and he's yelling at Lenny, and Lenny is terrified, and George realizes the effect that he has on him, and he feels really, really bad about it. So this is the convergence of speech, emotions, actions, thoughts. And again, it's a roller coaster of characterization. George is down, and then he's down, and he's down, and he's down, and he's so angry, and he's so upset, and he's so tired of this life. And yet, when it comes down to it, he's still willing to take on for Lenny. He still does what he knows Lenny needs. And so this is just a beautiful example of characterization and complex characterization. How deep we're going to go into this with George. Okay, so things go on in the chapter. They improve a little bit. And again, we're going to take a look at the speech and the actions and also the effect that George's characterization has on others. Well, said George, we'll have a big vegetable patch and a rabbit hutch and chickens, and when it rains in the winter, we'll just say the hell with going to work, and we'll build up a fire in the stove and sit around in it and listen to the rain coming down on the roof. Nuts. He took out his pocket knife. I ain't got time for no more. He drove his knife through the top of one of the bean cans, sawed out the top, and passed the can to Lenny. Then he opened a second can. From his side pocket, he brought out 2 spoons and passed one of them to Lenny. I would just like to make the claim here that George is extremely resourceful and dependable. He's going ahead and he's talking about his dreams, but at the same time, the reality of his situation is that he not only has to take care of himself, but he has to take care of Lenny. And here he is feeding him. Here he is pulling out these 2 spoons. So he's always watching out for the both of them. So his actions and his speech and his effect on others really do speak volumes about who he is as a person, as a character. There's always this old idea that, a person represents themselves by the things that they do, not the things that they say. So even though George does have those moments where he's really mad at Lenny, what he does for Lenny kind of outweighs what he says to Lenny. So they sat by the fire and filled their mouths with beans and chewed mightily. A few beans slipped out of the side of Lenny's mouth. George gestured with his spoon. What you gonna say tomorrow when the boss asks you questions? Lenny stopped chewing and swallowed. His face was concentrated. I ain't gonna say a word. Good boy, that's fine, Lenny. Maybe you're getting better. When we get the couple of acres, I can let you tend the rabbits all right, especially if you remember as good as that. Lenny choked with pride. I can remember, he said. So George has this capacity to really have an effect on how Lenny is feeling. We've seen Lenny crying. We've seen Lenny in terror. And now we see Lenny full of pride. So George's characterization has an effect on the people around him. And it's going to continue to have an effect as we move forward in the book. So this thing is just a list of some of the, character traits we might see. And I went ahead and highlighted a bunch of the different things I thought applied to George. He's certainly ambitious when he's talking about their future. He's definitely anxious because of the issues that Lenny has created. He might seem a little bossy. He's careful. You could absolutely call him cold-hearted, the way he kind of puts Lenny down. But at the same time, he's also compassionate because he brings him right back up. I would also add that he's frustrated. He's tired. He's nervous. He's really all of these things, and that's why characterization is just so darn important in this first chapter, because it runs the entire spectrum. There's really no one way to characterize George. So again, using the Steele formula, how would you characterize Lenny in chapter 1? And these are just a couple of things that I would like you to think of, and maybe even get into a discussion with classmates about this. These are just some of the things we saw as far as Lenny goes. He might not have the depth of thought that George does, but he certainly is in the conversation. He certainly has emotions, looks, and actions. So when Lenny's first described, it says, behind him walked his opposite, a huge man, shapeless of face, with large pale eyes and wide sloping shoulders. And he walked heavily, dragging his feet a little the way a bear drags his paws. His arms did not swing at his sides, but hung loosely. What does that tell you about Lenny? His huge companion dropped his blankets and flung himself down and drank from the surface of the green pool, drank with long gulps, snorting into the water like a horse. And Steinbeck does that a couple of times with Lenny. He describes him using animal imagery or similes, connecting Lenny and showing us how he acts like an animal in some ways. Lenny looked sadly up at him. They was so little, he said apologetically. I'd pet 'em, and pretty soon they bit my fingers, and I pinched their heads a little, and then they was dead because they was so little. I wish we'd get the rabbits pretty soon, George. They ain't so little. So he does have the capacity to, feel bad for the things that he has done, but he's still doing them. Lenny avoided the bait. He had sensed his advantage. If you don't want me, you only just got to say so, and I'll go off in those hills right there, right up in those hills and live by myself, and I won't get no mice stole from me. So again, he's able to play George a little bit here. He's bringing George back into him, so that George has to admit, listen, I want you to stay with me. I want you to be a part of, this team. And live off the fat of the land, Lenny shouted, the idiom for being able to provide for themselves. And have rabbits. Go on, George. Tell about what we're going to have in the garden, and about the rabbits in the cages, and about the rain and the winter and the stove, and how thick the cream is on the milk like you can hardly cut it. Tell about that, George. Why don't you do it yourself? You know all of it. So think about how Lenny is characterized in chapter 1. And that's what I'm going to have you do in the discussion. Hopefully this helped you see a little bit of examples of characterization. And best of luck to you all. I really hope that you are enjoying the book and so on and so forth. Watch for how the other people that are introduced are characterized. Other than that, enjoy.